Every story has its moment. Mine comes at 1,000 subscribers. Subscribe, and be here when the story is finally told. By early 1945, American naval operations in the Western Pacific had settled into a rhythm that felt routine on the surface, but carried constant strain underneath. Supply routes between the Philippines and forward staging areas near Okinawa were active day and night, protected by destroyer escorts, patrol craft, and rotating air cover. The fighting was no longer chaotic in the way Guadalcanal or Leyte had been, but the pressure had not eased. Every officer involved understood that the closer they moved to the Japanese home islands, the more unpredictable resistance became. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hale, operations officer aboard a destroyer escort assigned to coastal screening duties, had been in the Pacific since 1942. He had seen torpedo hits, air attacks, and the slow erosion of crews worn down by months at sea. His responsibility now was narrower but heavier, maintaining night security along cluttered coastlines where radar coverage was limited and identification mistakes were common. Hale was not a man given to dramatic thinking. He trusted procedures, logs, and disciplined response. That mindset had kept his ship intact so far. The first incident occurred shortly after midnight during a routine transit near a shallow coastal corridor. Radar contacts appeared briefly at close range, then vanished. Lookouts reported a fast-moving shape on the water. Low profile, no visible superstructure. Seconds later, a sharp impact struck a nearby landing craft assigned to the convoy. There was no explosion large enough to suggest a torpedo, no sustained fire, and no immediate follow-up attack. The unidentified craft turned away and disappeared into darkness and shoreline clutter. Damage control teams reported a narrow penetration in the hull plating and localized internal damage. The hit did not match what Hale or his gunnery officers expected from machine gun fire or small explosive charges. Still, the working assumption remained conservative. Coastal waters were full of debris, abandoned boats, and desperate improvisations. The Pacific Campaign had conditioned officers to expect suicidal actions from small craft, and this incident seemed to fit that pattern well enough to avoid escalation. Privately, Hale reviewed the reports twice. The damage bothered him, but not enough to override established doctrine. He was aware of the risk of overreacting, firing on non-combatants, misidentifying fishermen, or exhausting crews already stretched thin. The responsibility to avoid unnecessary engagements weighed heavily, especially at night, when a single mistake could ripple through command channels and end careers. In the days that followed, similar reports arrived from other units operating miles apart. Each described brief contact, minimal warning, and oddly precise damage. None involved recovered wreckage or confirmed enemy casualties. Each was logged, categorized, and filed under existing threat models. Intelligence summaries used familiar language: harassment, suicide attempts, isolated resistance. For Hale and officers like him, the tension lay in the gap between instinct and evidence. Something about the encounters felt controlled rather than desperate, deliberate rather than reckless. Yet without clear proof, there was no justification to alter procedures that governed thousands of ships and men. The investigation, at this stage, was limited to careful documentation, not action. On the surface, operations continued calmly. Convoys moved, watches rotated, reports were written in precise language. Beneath that routine, a quiet pressure accumulated, an unspoken awareness that the enemy was adapting and that the cost of misjudgment, even once, could be measured in lives rather than paperwork. The damage reports arrived at different hours, written by different officers, but they carried the same restrained tone that naval paperwork demanded. What drew attention was not the language, but the measurements. Plate thickness, angle of entry, fragmentation patterns, and the absence of blast scoring did not align with the threats officers were trained to expect from coastal harassment. A landing craft near the convoy route showed a clean puncture through its outer plating, followed by internal spalling that injured two crewmen who had been standing several feet away from the point of impact. There was no fireball, no tearing outward, no residue consistent with a shaped charge or mine. Lieutenant Commander Hale requested the damaged section be preserved rather than cut away immediately, a small decision that carried administrative risk but reflected a growing unease. He had learned early in the war that unusual damage, if ignored, tended to repeat itself under worse circumstances. The preserved plate was transferred to a forward repair anchorage where ordnance specialists could examine it under control conditions. The ordnance officer assigned to the inspection was Lieutenant Samuel Brooks, a reserve engineer pulled into active service after Pearl Harbor. Brooks had spent the previous year cataloging enemy munitions recovered from wrecked aircraft and abandoned coastal positions. He approached the task methodically, measuring the deformation of steel, examining rifling impressions barely visible along the interior edges of the hull, and comparing them against reference samples. His conclusion was cautious but firm. The projectile had mass and velocity inconsistent with heavy machine gun fire and lacked the fragmentation profile of naval shelling. Brooks briefed his findings without speculation. He stated only what could be demonstrated. The projectile had been solid, fired at short range, and stabilized by rifling. That meant a cannon, not an improvised charge. When asked whether such a weapon could be mounted on a small boat, he did not answer immediately. He had seen aircraft guns repurposed on trucks and static mounts during earlier island campaigns, but using one at sea, on a wooden platform, suggested planning rather than desperation. Hale listened without interrupting, aware that each additional detail narrowed the margin for error in future decisions. He also understood the consequences of misinterpretation. If the assessment was wrong, raising alarm would divert resources and strain already fragile command relationships. If it was right, continued restraint would place crews at risk from a threat they were not authorized to treat as lethal on sight. Operational logs were reviewed quietly. Lookout statements that had previously seemed vague took on new meaning when read alongside the technical findings. Reports of single flashes, brief recoil-like movements, and precise timing were no longer dismissed as confusion under stress. Radar gaps, once blamed on sea clutter, were reconsidered as deliberate exploitation of blind zones. No formal alert was issued. Instead, Hale authorized additional documentation requirements after night contacts and requested that unexploded material, no matter how small, be secured rather than discarded. These were incremental changes, easily justified on paper, but they reflected a shift in mindset. The assumption that the enemy was acting recklessly no longer held. Among the officers involved, the emotional response was muted but heavy. There was frustration at having dismissed earlier signs and a shared awareness that the margin for correction was narrowing. None spoke of blame. In the Pacific, errors were understood as cumulative, rarely traceable to a single decision. What mattered was recognizing them before they hardened into doctrine. As convoys continued to move under the same night sky, the investigation entered a new phase, still unofficial, still constrained, but no longer guided by habit alone. The threat had not yet been named, but it had been acknowledged, and that recognition carried its own quiet weight. The reports accumulated faster than they could be fully reconciled. Incidents that had once seemed isolated now formed a loose chain across multiple operating areas, linked not by proximity, but by timing, method, and restraint. Each encounter followed the same narrow window. Approach under low visibility, a single decisive strike, immediate withdrawal without pursuit. There was no pursuit fire, no attempt to press the attack, no indication of panic or loss of control. The enemy craft behaved as if governed by strict limits rather than impulse. At fleet headquarters, these similarities were acknowledged but interpreted incorrectly. Analysts, working under pressure to simplify threat assessments, treated each contact as a local improvisation rather than a shared doctrine. The assumption was that Japan's shrinking resources had forced regional commanders to act independently, producing similar but unrelated tactics. This conclusion fit existing expectations and required no structural changes. A decision followed that appeared reasonable on paper. Night patrols were ordered to increase illumination during periods of low radar confidence. Star shells, deck lighting, and intermittent searchlight sweeps were authorized to reduce hesitation and improve visual identification. The intent was control, clearer targets, fewer mistakes, faster decisions. The unintended consequence was exposure. Within days, the effects became apparent. Enemy approaches adjusted with precision. Boats appeared at the edges of illuminated zones, timing their movements between light cycles. Attacks occurred when ships were silhouetted against their own glare, making range estimation easier for the attacker and response fire slower for the defender. One destroyer escort suffered a hit that penetrated near a machinery space, triggering a fire that forced it out of formation for repairs. The attacking craft escaped without damage. Lieutenant Commander Hale reviewed the sequence of events with growing concern. The pattern suggested not adaptation after contact, but anticipation. Whoever was directing these attacks understood Allied procedures well enough to exploit them immediately. Hale felt the weight of responsibility acutely. He had not opposed the illumination order, trusting that visibility reduced risk. Now he watched its results unfold in damage reports and casualty lists. Crew reactions reflected a shift in morale. Sailors who had once dismissed the threat as harassment now treated every small wake and shadow as potentially lethal. The tension did not manifest as panic, but as fatigue. Eyes strained longer at night, gunners gripping controls with quiet intensity, officers hesitating a fraction longer before giving orders. The enemy was no longer abstract. It was present, disciplined, and close. Efforts to classify the attackers continued, but the lack of physical confirmation limited conclusions. No wreckage was recovered. No bodies surfaced. The absence itself became troubling. Suicide attacks left debris. Mines left patterns. This left nothing but precision damage and silence. Hale submitted a restrained memorandum questioning the effectiveness of increased illumination and noting the apparent coordination of enemy actions across sectors. The response was polite and non-committal. Resources were stretched, command attention divided among larger operations, and no one wanted to reframe a threat that remained officially minor. Privately, Hale adjusted his own ship's posture within the limits of his authority, reducing predictable lighting patterns and tightening response timelines. He knew this was not a solution, only a temporary mitigation. The larger error had already been made, and correcting it would require proof that could not be ignored. As operations continued, the investigation narrowed not toward the enemy alone, but toward Allied assumptions themselves. The realization was uncomfortable and unspoken. The danger was no longer just the unknown weapon, but the confidence with which it had first been dismissed. The break came without warning and without drama. At dawn, after a night of scattered contacts that produced no confirmed engagements, a patrol aircraft reported a stationary object drifting near a reef line just outside the usual attack corridor. It was too small to register as wreckage on earlier sweeps and too intact to be debris. A patrol boat was dispatched with orders to observe first and engage only if necessary. As the patrol closed the distance, the silhouette resolved into a narrow wooden craft riding low in the water. There were no signs of scuttling, no smoke, no movement on deck. The engine housing was partially flooded, and the bow bore fresh impact, marks consistent with small arms fire. The absence of bodies suggested a rapid abandonment rather than destruction. Boarding teams approached cautiously, aware that delayed charges or booby traps were standard practice in similar situations. What they found altered the investigation immediately. Bolted to reinforced deck beams was a single aircraft cannon, its breech exposed, its barrel aligned forward along the boat's centerline. The mounting was crude but deliberate. Steel brackets scavenged from airframe components, wooden spacers cut to absorb recoil, and a manually operated firing mechanism linked by cable to a seated position behind the weapon. There was no armor, no shielding. Everything about the installation prioritized weight reduction and balance. Lieutenant Commander Hale was flown to the anchorage where the craft had been secured. He He studied the weapon in silence, tracing the serial number stamped near the breech. It matched records of aircraft losses from the previous year. This was not speculation or pattern analysis. It was physical proof. The weapon had not been fired blindly. The sighting alignment was adjusted for short-range accuracy, and spent casings recovered from the deck confirmed controlled, limited firing rather than panic. Naval engineers documented the recoil system with particular attention. The mount allowed just enough backward movement to prevent structural failure without destabilizing the hull. This was not an experiment conducted under fire. It reflected testing, iteration, and training. The implication was unavoidable. The crews operating these boats expected to survive their attacks. Hale felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. The confirmation carried weight because it validated earlier doubts while exposing the cost of delay. Men had been injured while the threat was being debated. He understood that responsibility was diffuse, spread across assumptions, doctrine, and the sheer scale of the war. But the knowledge did not lessen its impact. Intelligence officers compiled the findings into a report stripped of interpretation. Photographs, measurements, and serial numbers were presented without commentary. The evidence spoke clearly enough. Aircraft that could no longer fly had been dismantled. Their weapons had been adapted for naval ambush at close range. The choice of platform, small, fast, expendable boats, was dictated by geography and material shortage, not fanaticism. The recovered craft answered several operational questions at once. The absence of debris in earlier attacks was explained by successful withdrawals. The precision of hits was accounted for by stabilized cannon fire at minimal range. The restraint shown during engagements reflected limited ammunition and explicit disengagement criteria. As the investigation advanced, the atmosphere among officers shifted from uncertainty to controlled urgency. There was no celebration in having been proven right. Only the sober recognition that the enemy had solved a problem the Allies had underestimated. The boat was secured, cataloged, and transferred for further analysis. Orders were prepared for dissemination, still pending formal approval. Hale returned to his ship knowing that the next phase would not be about discovery, but response. And that response would arrive late for some, but not, he hoped, for all. The captured crew were brought ashore separately, moved through holding areas without ceremony, and processed under standard naval intelligence procedures. There were 3 of them, all young enough to have been trained late in the war, yet none displayed the agitation or emotional volatility often associated with suicide units. Their clothing was worn but orderly, their hands steady during intake searches. They complied without hesitation, not out of submission, but out of what appeared to be discipline. The senior interrogator assigned to the case was Commander Alan Reeves, a naval intelligence officer who had spent most of the war questioning downed pilots and coastal defense personnel across the Central Pacific. Reeves was careful in his approach. He avoided confrontation and ideology, focusing instead on sequence, procedure, and mechanical detail. He understood that men trained for technical tasks responded best to precise questions. The first sessions produced limited information. The prisoners confirmed their unit designation and area of operations, but avoided broader strategic discussion. What stood out was consistency. Each man described the same training regimen: range estimation at night, engine handling under load, cannon firing drills conducted from anchor platforms before transitioning to moving targets. None spoke of sacrifice. None described their mission as final or symbolic. Reeves noted the absence immediately. In earlier interrogations involving suicide craft, the language had been absolute: honor, inevitability, final duty. Here, the vocabulary was practical: fuel limits, firing windows, escape routes mapped along shallow channels inaccessible to larger ships. The crews had been instructed to disengage after 1 or 2 shots, regardless of damage inflicted. When questioned about aircraft weapons, one prisoner explained without hesitation that the cannons were removed from fighters no longer fit for flight. The airframes were dismantled inland, the weapons transported by truck, and the mounts assembled locally using carpentry crews familiar with boat repair. The recoil systems were tested repeatedly, failures recorded and corrected. Losses during training were acknowledged without emotion. Reeves felt a quiet shift as the picture clarified. These were not men driven forward by ideology alone, but by assignment. They had been selected for steadiness, mechanical aptitude, and the ability to operate without supervision. Their commanders expected results, not martyrdom. Survival meant experience, and experience meant improved effectiveness. This reframing carried operational consequences. The enemy was not exhausting itself in reckless gestures. It was conserving manpower, refining technique, and exploiting allied hesitation. The assumption that desperation equaled inefficiency collapsed under the weight of detail now documented in interrogation transcripts and technical appendices. Lieutenant Commander Hale reviewed the summaries late at night in his cabin, the ship's engines vibrating faintly through the deck. The knowledge settled heavily. Earlier judgments, his own included, had been shaped by familiarity rather than evidence. The enemy had been categorized before it was understood. There was no anger in Hale's reaction, only responsibility. He thought of the damaged ships, the wounded sailors, and the narrow margins that had separated caution from delay. The investigation had now reached clarity, but clarity arrived with consequence. Reeves closed the interrogation files with a final note emphasizing predictability. These units would continue to operate as long as conditions allowed. They would not escalate without cause. They would not disappear on their own. The enemy had been identified, not as an aberration, but as a system. What remained was not discovery, but correction, and that correction would test whether the lessons learned could be applied before the cost increased further. The response unfolded without ceremony. Orders were issued through routine channels, framed as refinements rather than corrections. Night engagement protocols were revised to remove ambiguity where hesitation had previously been encouraged. Small, fast-moving contacts operating inside defined coastal zones were no longer treated as uncertain classifications requiring layered confirmation. Command authority for immediate engagement was pushed downward, placing responsibility where seconds mattered rather than minutes. Patrol patterns changed first. Predictable routes were abandoned in favor of overlapping coverage that denied shallow escape corridors. Illumination doctrine was rewritten, replacing broad visibility with controlled darkness and staggered lighting cycles that favored the defender. Radar operators were instructed to treat intermittent returns as actionable rather than dismissible clutter. Gunnery crews drilled against fleeting targets, firing based on movement and intent rather than perfect identification. Lieutenant Commander Hale oversaw the transition aboard his ship with measured focus. He did not address the crew with speeches or explanations beyond what duty required. Sailors understood change when they saw it. Watches tightened. Response times shortened. The atmosphere shifted from strain to controlled readiness. Fear did not disappear, but became structured, bounded by procedure rather than uncertainty. The effect was immediate and unremarkable. Attempts at approach were detected earlier and engaged decisively. Several enemy boats were destroyed at range before firing positions could be reached. Others turned away without contact, their routes compromised. There were no dramatic engagements, no single decisive night. The attacks simply diminished, then stopped. Intelligence confirmed the outcome weeks later. Intercepted communications and post-war document recovery showed that losses among the specialized boat units could not be replaced. Salvaged aircraft stocks were exhausted. Experienced crews were gone. The system that had enabled the threat collapsed under conditions it could no longer control. Commander Reeves compiled the final assessment in language stripped of judgment. The case was documented as a failure of early interpretation rather than intelligence collection. The enemy tactic had not been hidden, it had been misread. The corrective measures succeeded not because of superior force, but because assumptions were finally aligned with evidence. Hale signed the closing reports without satisfaction. The knowledge that the resolution had come after avoidable damage remained. Responsibility, in his mind, did not require blame, but acknowledgement. The lessons were entered into manuals and training circulars, absorbed quietly into doctrine, where they would outlive the men who learned them the hard way. When the war ended months later, the case drew no attention. There were no commendations tied to it, no public accounts. The devil boats did not enter popular memory. They existed only in after-action reports, technical diagrams, and the recollections of those who had stood watch during the narrow window when small shapes on dark water carried disproportionate consequence. For Hale, the closure was simple and sufficient. The threat had been understood, addressed, and ended. The cost had been counted honestly. In a war defined by scale and spectacle, this episode ended as many real ones did, quietly, with procedures adjusted, lives preserved thereafter, and the weight of responsibility carried forward without ceremony.